Great. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to at least be broadcasting to you. Hopefully you can see me, and yeah, looking forward to a fun session, Charlie.
I'm sure it's going to be fabulous. So we'll start with our first question. Just so everyone listening can understand a little bit more about you, could you please tell us about your role at the Natural History Museum and your pathway into it?
Sure, thank you. So I'm the what they call the director at the Natural History Museum, which, if you like, is the equivalent of the headmistress or the headmaster. So in other words, I'm here to, there's a day-to-day, make sure nothing goes horribly wrong, make sure we're open, the visitors can come in, have a great experience, make sure that all the specimens are carefully looked after. And then there's a sort of longer term, what are we going to do next? What's our planning? Where do we come from? So that's, if you like, keeping an eye on the whole organisation, making sure it's sort of ticking over, doing both the things we need to do today, but also thinking about the things we need to do tomorrow and into the future. So that's if you like, my job. As I say, think of me as the headmistress or headmaster of the museum, if you like, trying to keep us all on the straight and narrow. Excuse me. In terms of the path into it, I had a slightly unusual path. I'd never actually worked full time in a museum until I took this job on. And as Charlie said earlier, most of my sort of jobs were in the commercial world, particularly in technology. So I in particular spent just about 9.5 years at Amazon before joining the museum, working a little bit in the UK. I then ran all our China businesses for 3 years, and then I was the head of Amazon here in the UK before I took this job on. So that, if you like, you might think is a bit of an odd jump. But as we'll probably explore a bit more we go through, there's an amazing amount of technology in museums these days. And alongside, if you like, having that day job working for Amazon, I'd always loved museums, and I'd been working, in fact, as a volunteer and then a trustee and then the chair of the board of the Science Museum next door for a long time. So I knew a little bit about museums and a little bit about technology, and for some reason they thought that was a nice enough combination to offer me the chance to come and have a go at the Natural History Museum. So that's me today.
Great, thank you for that one. I think it's really interesting how, how relevant technology and museums kind of are becoming together. So that's really interesting. And I hope you can learn a little bit more about that, and maybe this next question will help with that. So please, could you tell us about the role of museums in the digital world?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you say, if you think about museums, you tend to think about the sort of the physical objects you come and see. And if you like, a museum is always, it's always about the collection, and our collection is a collection of natural history. So that means specimens, it means dinosaurs, it means whales, it means insects, it means butterflies, it means plants, it also means rocks. So we have a lot of meteorites here and all those things. So if you like, it's a really physical collection of objects. So you'd think, well, what on earth has that got to do with technology, and what on earth has that got to do with the digital world? But of course, everything has to do with the digital world these days. And I think the ways in which you sort of think about it is, one way of thinking about it is, as I say, a museum is about its collection, and that's about a physical object. But actually, we know that those objects can be amazing. So if you stand underneath Dippy, our sort of Diplodocus, there's a certain moment when you just go, wow, huge, amazing. But then hopefully that makes you think, well, how did something get so big? And how long ago did she live? And what did he eat? And there are lots of questions you want to ask. And in a sense, that physical office inspires you to think about, well, what are the stories that go behind this particular specimen? And really what the digital world lets you do is say, how can we tell lots and lots more stories about our collection? And we know that an object is much more powerful when you understand the story that goes behind it. So if anybody's ever seen the Central Hall, we have an entire blue whale skeleton hanging up there. It weighs about 4 tons, a skeleton, and it's vast. And you look at that and you go, gosh, that's amazing. But then if I tell you some of the stories, you'll think that's even more amazing. So if I tell you, well, that was a blue whale called Hope. She drowned off the coast of Ireland in 1830, so quite a long time ago. And Hope came to the museum in 1830. And actually, amazingly enough, if anybody know that part of London where the museum is, Hope was actually buried in a big sand pit in Hyde Park, which is a big public park, for about 4 years as she gradually turned into a skeleton. And I'm reliably informed by my whale experts that whales rotting down have a really nasty smell. So you can imagine why the local residents got a bit unhappy about that. But actually, what we now know is so much more about hope, because the science you can bring tells you things like we've now been able to figure out, based on analysing some of the plates that Hope laid down, we've been able to recreate her journey for the last 3 years of her life. So we know that every year she migrated from the coast of Africa all the way to Ireland and back again. And in the days when, and we also know that Hope, by the way, was pregnant and actually gave birth to a baby about 6 months before she died. And that's a fascinating story. But in the days when we had to communicate through a little piece of white card like that with about 10 words on it, we couldn't tell very many stories. And typically we had to choose one story. So you might walk in and it would just tell you, this is a blue whale, you know, and its Latin name is this and whatever. And you think, well, that's all very well. But actually, I want to know, how did she live? What did she eat? Who were her friends? How did she travel? How did she die? You know, is her grandchild still swimming around her now? And one of the beauties of the technology in the digital world is you can suddenly start to take each of those objects and tell so many more stories. And in particular, we can hopefully, if we do our job well, we can reach out to each one of you and tell you the stories that you're interested in. So hopefully it begins to just take a museum which has these incredible, beautiful, in some cases, powerful objects, and turn them into really meaningful stories that we can then engage with, you know, with everybody listening on this call. So if you have a story you're interested in, we're trying to find a way of helping you understand that story.
Yeah, that's really something. I visited the museum quite a while ago, and you know that never even occurred to me that that's crazy. So you've taught me something about something that I've even seen in person, and maybe some of the people watching are also having that sort of moment now as well. That's really wonderful to hear, and it's kind of exciting to see what this kind of digital world can do to blend with museums and how it can help us learn. So why is technology so important in museums? I know you've touched on that a little bit already, but is there anything else you'd want to add?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, in a sense, I've talked a little bit about how you take the collection and you tell stories around it, and technology enables you to connect with much broader audiences. So we all know that you know, we can do a speaker event and we can visit one school, and that's fabulous. But we have the opportunity now to do this broadcast and reach many more. And actually, one of the most important things about technology is saying, how do you take a collection, which is a fabulous collection, but if you like, before technology, we were sort of saying to everybody, you've got to come all the way to London to view this collection. And maybe if you're really lucky, we'll bring one or two things out to see you. So what technology does is enables you to open up that collection to not just everybody here across the UK, but actually to the whole world. So if you're a young school child doing your SATs or whatever, or your Key Stage 4 in Sao Paulo, and you may not have the opportunity to travel around the world and visit these collections, we can still connect you with those collections. So we can make all of that stuff that's been invisible visible. And I think for me, that's one of the most powerful things you do. The technology lets you connect with a much broader group of audiences and connect all around the world. As we talked a little bit before, Charlie, it also enables you to make that connection much more meaningful to every single person, because we're not just giving you our view, we're trying to figure out what is it that you're interested in. And as you say, if you come from Brazil, you might actually be interested in stories about animals or plants from Brazil you can see, or, you know, if you were there when a meteorite went splat in Germany, well, tell me a bit more about that. So we can make much bigger connections, and we can make them hopefully more interesting and relevant by telling the right stories to the right people. And then the final bit we should talk a little bit about is one of the things that people sometimes visit our museum and they see this beautiful building we're very lucky to have, and this amazing collection, and that's fabulous, and we love those visitors. What they sometimes don't see is that actually behind the scenes, as well as being, if you like, a visitor attraction, we're also a scientific institute. So we actually have over 350 full-time scientists and 150 people doing PhDs here, doing research into the natural world. And for those people, actually the technology, when we start to apply it to create things like what we call a digital twin of every specimen, that enables us to ask some really interesting scientific questions.
Yes, I guess when you go to a museum, you don't always think about the kind of science and the fact that these museums will also work to kind of further our knowledge and understanding of the world around us. And maybe that's something we need to pay a little bit more attention to when we are exploring the museums that we have available to us.
Yeah, no, exactly so. So if I, well, first of all, to give you a feel for the scale of what's hidden. If you think about, I mean, you've visited a museum, Charlie, it's a pretty big museum, isn't it? You know, it's going to take a while to get through that. But I'll tell you, here's a little maths question for everybody. If you think about that vast museum and it's, you know, days and days to get through it, there's about 27,500 specimens on display to the public. But the full collection behind the scenes to support the science is actually over 80 million specimens. Yeah, so if you do your little maths, that tells you for every one thing you see, we have 3,000 more hidden behind the scenes. And that 3,000 more is an amazing, rich resource, because this includes, you know, collections of insects and plants going all the way back through time. So if anybody's heard of Charles Darwin, who did this famous journey on the Beagle, well, Darwin collected an enormous number of things, or Banks, who travelled with Captain Cook and was the first Europeans to visit Australia and New Zealand, and they brought a lot of specimens back. And of course, all those specimens sit in the basement of the Natural History Museum, and they've been quite hidden away. So we're trying to make them a bit more visible. But the other amazing things those specimens give you is they're actually a window back into time. So if you think about some of the challenges we face today in terms of, you know, what's happening with the climate and what's happening with land use or plastic pollution, you know, we want to understand what impact might that have on life here on Earth. And actually, one of the best ways of doing that is to go back in time and say, well, if we understand where you know, the impact that, say, climate has had on life in the past, that gives us the best chance of building the kind of models. And so that collection and digitizing that collection and making it available for science is a really important resource. And if I may give you one very simple example right now, as we all know, we've been through this horrendous coronavirus pandemic, and it's been awful and tragic for many people and very difficult for many families. And it's important we understand, you know, where did it come from? Could it happen again? How did it happen? And actually, the science of how a disease jumps from an animal species to humans is very poorly understood. And we think, or at least a lot of the scientists think, that coronavirus may have started in bats and moved to humans. But actually, we don't know for sure, and we don't really understand how it happened. So actually, the museum's been working, leading a project with a number of other museums around the world. We've got 9 institutions where we're basically creating digital copies of every single bat in every collection. So we'll be able to go across the whole world and back through time and just say, where are all the bats? And then amazingly these days, we can actually now go back into these old specimens, and through what we call ancient DNA techniques, we can test them for DNA. DNA is a very complicated molecule that sort of tells you what life is. And in particular, we can test these bats and work out, did any of them have coronavirus? And if so, was it all around the world? Was it just in certain parts of the world? Was it very recent? Had it been there for a long time? And so this is how you begin to use these extraordinary sort of collection resources to start to answer really important scientific questions for us around the world today.
Yeah, I think that's really amazing. And, you know, to hear that the collection is so big and so vast and so much is hidden, I would hate to be the person out there choosing what goes on display. That must be a nightmare of a job.
Well, it's yeah, one of the things we like to talk about is sharing the wonder. But yes, as you can imagine, you sit and look at these drawers and drawers, and then how do you choose? Fortunately, we have some wonderful people who are great at getting there. But unfortunately, we're very fortunate with a lot of the scientists and the curators, and actually being a museum curator is a fascinating job because you get to look after all of these collections. You know, when we go and talk to them, they've all got their favourites. They're saying, "Oh no, you really must get this wonderful thing I have out there on display," and it is magical stuff, as I say.
Fab. So our next question is, please could you provide us with some examples of how the Natural History Museum has used emerging and exciting technologies?
Yes, that's a great example. Well, let me give you a good example about how we answer an important question, which is imagine you're out there excavating and you're doing your digging with your little shovel and whatever, and you unearth a dinosaur. Which from time to time we do, and we've actually just acquired a wonderful new dinosaur on the Isle of Wight. One of the questions you want to know, first of all, is how old is that dinosaur? And dinosaurs, remember, lived a long time ago, so they were around. The last of the dinosaurs disappeared about 66 million years ago, so that's an awful long time ago. So what you find are fossils, which are effectively the dinosaur bones have turned to rock. So it's quite hard to sort of really tell when you get this. And typically they might have been a bit squashed, or hundreds of million years have gone by, and so they're a bit squished up. So it's quite hard to date a dinosaur because it's not obvious, and you can't And it's because it's rock, you can't use any of these carbon dating techniques or things people do. So the way you date a dinosaur is you find very often, particularly if they've lived in the sea, you get what we call microfossils, which are teeny little fossils of different types of creatures with little shells and things that have survived. And there are so many of them, you often find them in lots of in great quantity. And the good news is, because these things evolved over time, depending on the shape and the size and the look and feel, if you can work out which ones you've got, you can get a pretty accurate date. And by the way, pretty accurate in dinosaur terms means about 1 million years. So it's not that accurate, but you know, that's really important for us to understand sort of where did the dinosaurs come from and how they changed and what affected them and what does that mean for us today. But the way you do that at the moment or in the past is you would get somebody who you train up as an expert, and they would sit there with a microscope like this and painstakingly go through all of this sort of ground up stuff and look at them and try and work out what sort of shapes have I got, and then you would do a dating. And that's very effective, but it's very slow. And so we have, for the majority of our fossils, we've not been able to date them yet because we haven't been able to work through all of these. And now what we're saying is, well, let's use some of these newfangled techniques and things like machine learning and computer vision, where we say to ourselves, can we train a computer that will actually be able to automatically recognize these different types of microfossils? And then we basically just take 2D or 3-dimensional pictures of every fossil, run it through these things, and we'll have dates for every fossil, and then we'll learn a lot more than we know about this. So some really interesting work you can do where you basically take a lot of human expertise and you say, how can we bring in some modern technology or some AI or some machine learning to make it even faster? I'll give you another simple example, which you've got running right now, which is one of the most important things when you're trying to work out what's going on with nature around you is, how do you observe it? How can you see it? How is it changing? If you build a new road or a factory happens, or if the air pollution changes, what changes? And the problem is it's quite hard to do this because you've got to go out there and capture them and count them and do all of these things. So again, it's very labour intensive and very slow and very human activity. But actually, some of our scientists have now started to say, well, if we can just record the sounds we hear, and they've now written very clever machine learning that can actually, just from the sounds you're recording, automatically identify, is that a cricket or is that a bat or something like that. So now, if you've just got somewhere in your school, somewhere that's just listening and recording, and we can run some clever sort of computer software on it, we can automatically start recognizing the species that live around you. So those are just some of the amazing examples of how technology is just beginning to completely transform not just museums, but our whole understanding of the natural world.
Definitely not heard of some of those pieces of tech, and I'm sure people watching haven't
Watch
either.
this space. They're coming.
Yeah, really interesting to find out more, which kind of leads us on, and you touched just a little bit on it, but what is machine learning?
Such a great question, because we hear these terms, don't we, all the time, AI, machine learning, what is it? And in really simple terms, think about what does any computer do? It takes what we call some input information, and it produces some output information. That's all it does. And you can do that in lots of different ways. So, for example, you could take two numbers, 2 and 3, add them together, get an answer, which, if my maths is correct, should be 5. You know, so you could do that, where it takes some inputs, get an outputs. And a lot of computers, when we first started working on them, programming them, worked by just basically what you'd call we gave them a really clear set of instructions, and that's exactly what they did. But then we found there were all sorts of problems that were really difficult to solve that way. So a great example of, give me a photograph of a cat and try and work out if it's a cat or a dog. Now, you'd think that'd be, I mean, we look at it, we go, it's obviously a cat. It's got pointy ears and a little funny nose and nice whiskers, and, you know, that's obviously a dog. And by the way, not just a dog, I can tell you which breed of dog. So, you know, we're very good at telling the difference between cats and dogs. And computers were not very good, because we used to start by saying, well, let's take a picture and try and break it down and try and recognize what looked like eyes and what looked like whiskers and what looked like ears and are they pointy. And you can see you'd write this whole long series of instructions. And we tried that for a long time, and it didn't really work very well. But at the same time, we had another different sort of approach, which we call machine learning, which basically just says we start out with lots of pictures of cats and dogs, and we have a machine in the middle that just basically, you know, has a sort of what we call an algorithm that basically just says, put a cat in and we say to the machine, this one's a cat, this one's a dog, this one's a cat, this one's a dog. In other words, and we call that a set of training data. In other words, we just show the machine lots of pictures of cats, lots of pictures of dogs, and it figures out internally, it then changes its weighting depending on the colours it saw and all of this to produce an answer. And we call that a training data set. And that machine learning is teaching the machine how to recognise cats and dogs. And once you've taught it on a certain set of pictures, we can then show it new pictures of cats and new pictures of dogs. And it turns out that if you start with what we call a big enough set of training pictures, and we have enough computer power, that actually these machine learning sort of programs tend out to be really good at things like recognizing cats and dogs, or understanding human speech these days, or some of these applications. So it's a really fabulous, quite new. I mean, honestly, when I started, none of this existed, and a lot of this is really in the last only maybe 15, but probably 5 or 10 years that the computers have got powerful enough and good enough to be able to solve some of these things. And that sort of way of training a computer is what we call machine learning. But it's most basic. It's incredibly simple. Start with a very basic question you're trying to decide. Is it black? Is it white? Show it lots of examples to train it up, and then let it loose and see how good it is at actually solving that problem.
I think that's a really good kind of foundation of what machine learning is. I think that was really well explained. So, I've definitely got an understanding of what it is now. So how are businesses using machine learning?
That's a great question. So in a sense, increasingly, one way you can think about a business is that it's an organization that makes lots of decisions. So again, if you think back to when I ran Amazon, a simple example of something that Amazon would have to do is say, Charlie, let's say you come onto the Amazon website this afternoon and you're interested in looking at something or buying something or whatever. And we sort of know, because you're super busy, you haven't got much time, you've probably got time to look at 4 or 5 different items or detail pages before you have to make a decision. And the challenge for an organization like Amazon is that Amazon has over 250 million items to offer you. And so there's what I would call the discoverability problem, which is when you turn up this afternoon, how do we choose from that universe of 250 million, the 4 or 5 that are most likely to be interesting to you? And that's a really hard thing to do by just, let me just choose the 5 most popular from the entire 250 million catalogue. Because different people will be interested in different things. You might be going to a party and you're looking for an outfit. You might be coming up to your sort of GCSEs and you're desperate to get a study guide. So the way in which you start to deploy machine learning and these algorithms is you say, can we actually know a little bit about the things you've looked at in the past, maybe some of the places you've been, get a sense of the kind of things you're interested in based on what other people have done. And then Amazon would use that information to figure out which are the most interesting things to present to you. So very often what businesses are doing is trying to take all of those decisions they have to make. How much should I price things? Where should I place inventory? How much do I buy? What should I show you at scale? And trying to use this machine learning to make those decisions just that, not better is probably the wrong way of putting it. The real value that businesses get is they can make decisions much, much faster. If you can make decisions much, much faster, you can suddenly start to make them for individuals rather than just one size fits all. So that's probably the single biggest way in which we see businesses using AI and machine learning, is just to accelerate their decision making, and not just by like 5 times or 10 times. It could be 1 million times faster or 1 billion times faster, and then you can start to get these much more sort of granular, fine-grained decision making. And that turns out for businesses to be really important, that if we can create a personal experience for you, it's more likely to be relevant and it's more likely to sort of fulfill the customer's needs.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, especially kind of how that information will be helpful to Amazon. And our next question is probably something that the young people are interested in hearing, which is, what kind of impact can machine learning have on future job roles?
It's a brilliant question, Charlie, and it's sort of for everybody there listening. I'm sure you're at that point of thinking about, what do I do next and where do I go and how's the world of work going to change? And in a sense, it's sometimes helpful to look back in the past and say, how did the world of work change when technology came in the past? Because all of this stuff is just another technology coming in. And if you think about to when there were waves of things like robotics and automation and machines coming in, what we tended to find is businesses would look at a lot of the sort of, the sort of more boring, repetitive, routine jobs and just say, can we actually get machines to do those? Whether it was, these days we tend to manufacture stuff in large machines. We don't tend to hand manufacture bottles of glass or cars or things like that. So increasingly what you saw was, whereas if you go back 40, 50 years, a lot of jobs would have involved sitting there every day on an assembly line, bashing in a rivet, bashing in a rivet, bashing in a rivet. Now, increasingly, you want to train a robot or an automated production line to do all of that boring, repetitive, not that interesting stuff. And so what that really means is if you do your job well, and what we've seen whenever technologies have come in the past is we've sort of said, well, what is it that people are really good at doing? And I think the kind of stuff we're seeing that people are really good at doing is creative thinking, is training computers on how to work, is problem solving, is being able to recognize those patterns, and fundamentally is also actually talking to people. And we're people, we like talking to people. Turns out we don't like talking to machines that much for good and obvious reasons. So I think as you think about the world of work, it's really hard to say definitely this job, definitely that job. But I can kind of guarantee you the direction of travel will be more towards the skills that you have in interacting with other people and getting good about that. It'll definitely be more towards the creative, the thinking, the value add, whether you're an English literature student or a French student or a scientist or whatever, think creative. And increasingly increasingly I think it will also involve working with automation and technology and things. And that's as we all do every day. That's how we're talking to each other. It's how we're using that. So I think we'll need a familiarity with how to use technology. But the real question is, I think the jobs that will be interesting going forward are how do we use the things that people are really good at, which is that creative, that inventive, that imaginative, that storytelling, that interactive, and then try and get the machines to do this and the computers to do the slightly more boring stuff. So those are the things to kind of think about.
I definitely like the way of thinking of that. Get the machines to do the boring bits and allow us to kind of do all the other stuff.
Exactly. We want people in charge, exactly, doing the interesting work.
Great. So that's the end of our kind of interview questions. We're going to move on to our Q&A section now. And we're going to start with a couple that have been submitted to us anonymously. So we're not sure which schools they belong to, but they have been sent in for you to answer. So we're going to start off with one about museums and technology. So somebody has asked, what do you think is the future for museums in our high-tech world where people don't seem to have much of an attention span?
Oh, that's such, you could almost have been sitting in our meeting this morning when we were talking about exactly this question, which is, how do we do this? And I think for me, it comes back to, as you rightly say, there are so many things that, compete for our attention now, whether it's, things we can do on our phones or activities or sports or whatever. And you sort of think, why would you, where would a museum even fit in that? And I think for me, it comes down to two things. It comes down to one really fundamental question, fundamental point about a museum, which is within a museum, you have the real object. And when you watch a visitor on that moment when they walk into a museum and they stand in front of something, they stand in front of a lump of rock that came from Mars. An asteroid smashed into Mars, knocked something off, it found its way all the way to Earth, it didn't burn up in the atmosphere. People hunted around, we identified it, we used amazing science to prove it came from Mars, and then you look at it. And there are only 70 of these in the world, by the way, and little plug, 13 of them, I think, in the Natural History Museum. So when you look at something like that and you hold it in your hand or you're right up to it, it has a sort of magic and a power that you never quite get from a photograph or an image or a copy. So there is something about standing in front of the real thing that I think is partly deep, and at its heart, museums are about fundamentally, as I say, the collection's the real thing, whether it's a work of art or a beautiful tapestry, or in our case, wonderful, diamonds or natural history collections or meteorites or dinosaurs. The real thing matters. But I think the role of technology then is to say, well, it's back to that point we talked about earlier about how do you open it up, how do you make the invisible visible, how do you engage, and it's both. It's the moments between times when you can't come. It's how between times do we, if you saw that and you were interested, how do we help you find out more? How do we make sure that the next time you visit, that's an even more richer experience because you know what you want it to look like and you've done a bit of research for it. So you've almost got this, what I call a continuous level of engagement, and there are these spikes on the moments when you arrive and you get curious and you see something interesting that inspires you to carry on, then you carry on, then you maybe come again or come again. So I think that's where you've got this lovely interplay between what will always be the ultimate experience of come and commune with the real thing, but interwoven with that continuous almost on engagement dialogue that enables, you know, our visitors and our audiences to keep engaging digitally. So I think that's roughly how certainly we see it. And then obviously behind that sits obviously the collections database and the story database and obviously the visitor database, so we can talk to you and engage with you.
Yes, certainly. And our next question, again, that's still around kind of museums and technology and things like that, is how can museums inspire remotely? Visiting a museum is a very different to look at the collections online, but visiting sometimes can be a little bit expensive.
You know, I completely agree with that, and I think one of the things one of the challenges you've always had about the museums is, look, the collection is concentrated in one location. In our case, most of the collection is in central London. That's an expensive place to visit. It's hard to get to. You know, I live up in Yorkshire. It takes my family a while to get down here. So there's, you know, and it's almost a you must come to us to see it. And I think actually a huge responsibility of all of our national museums is to get those collections out to the people. And we can do it obviously sometimes through touring exhibitions. So I mean, a good example here was Dippy, which is, as we like to say, the nation's favorite dinosaur, wonderful iconic specimen. And Dippy spent, you know, 3.5 years going around venues all around all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. And it was wonderful because, you know, whether it was Belfast or Cardiff or Rochdale or Norwich, to actually have Dippy there and for each of the local communities to be able to figure out what does Dippy mean to us and how do we make it relevant was amazing. And I think 2.2 million people came and saw Dippy on tour. So that's one way of doing it. You do a national touring program. But actually what's super exciting about the technology is you can go so much further. And as I mentioned, you know, it's both in terms of, as I say, it's not a complete substitute for the moments when you can come and see the real thing, but it's pretty amazing to be able to go in and explore all the stories. And by the way, I encourage everybody, please do come and explore all the stories. There's tons of material there, whatever you're interested in, and we're working really hard to build it up and make it even more relevant and even more interesting. So if somebody's fascinated by volcanoes, you know, you can actually come in and look at the specimens online and study it and understand the science and talk to some of the people whose communities have been affected by volcanoes. And you can do that from anywhere in the world, because whilst we're a UK national institution, the reality is we have a global collection from all around the world. The science is global, the environmental challenges we're trying to address are global, and our audience is global. So amazingly, I think even though we only do our websites and so on in English, more than half our website audience is from outside the UK, and it's from literally all over the world. And that's a great example where some of these audiences may never get the opportunity to come and visit the museum because they might live in a country which or they might not have the financial means to be able to do so, but we can still engage them, we can still tell the stories, we can still get there, and hopefully if they get really interested one day, they'll grow up and want to be a scientist and come and work at the museum. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. Really interesting as well to hear about Dippy and his adventures.
Dippy, by the way, is doing a temporary stop back in London. So if anybody would like to come and see Dippy, I apologise, you'll have to get yourself down to London. But after that, actually, we're actually going to take Dippy. We're going to put Dippy out on long-term loan. So we've got a competition running right now. So if you're interested, you know, have a word with your school, you know, talk to people in your local community. We're going to send Dippy out for a 3-year loan and then another 3-year loan after that for whoever's got the best ideas of why Dippy should come and live in my town. That would be fantastic.
I definitely love that. Get involved out there, anyone who's watching, now's your chance. So we have a different question now. So thinking in terms of Amazon, do you think their model of click and buy is sustainable in a world that has climate change targets?
Oh, that is such a good and important question. I mean, the short answer, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is yes, but let me explain the yes, because in a sense here at the museum, our subject matter, if you like, is planet Earth and life on planet Earth. That's what we study, and it's a big subject, obviously. But we do see a problem, which is, and there's no single obvious way of looking at this, but pretty much all the information we look at tells us that life is under threat. We look at species going extinct, we look at the loss of habitats, and we see real threats to life on Earth. And by the way, we've sort of been here before. So with the advantage of the fossil record, we can go right back to the dawn of time. We know that life has been around on Earth for 3,500 million years, and it's very ancient. But we also know that over that period, there've been 5 occasions, just 5 occasions, when almost all the life disappeared. And we call these mass extinction events, and on each occasion it was a significant change in the environmental conditions. Heating, cooling, ocean acidification, the environmental conditions change, and it wiped out almost all of the species. And it's happened 5 times, and most recently was 66 million years ago when we lost the last of the dinosaurs. And by the way, dinosaurs are a really interesting sort of case study, because dinosaurs were everywhere. I mean, we think of them as these lumbering, long gone beings, but they were all over the face of the earth. They were everywhere. They would have been walking through your town or your village or your city. They covered the whole Earth's surface, and they ruled that for 200 million years. And humans have been around for about 30,000 years. So, and yet all the dinosaurs went. So these mass extinction events are incredibly rare, but they do happen. And the scary bit, and I'm coming back to the very good question you answered, the scary bit is a lot of the information is telling us we could be heading for a 6th mass extinction. And its causes would be exactly as you called out. It would be partly climate, be a lot to do with how we use land, and it would also be a lot to do with pollution. And so if you like, our job here at the museum is to say, well, first of all, is there anything we can do about it? Is it too late? Is so much harm being done we can't do it? And a hugely important piece of work was done about 1.5 years ago by a gentleman called Partha Dasgupta, which really tried to answer, if you like, the exam question was, is there a world in which we can still have the kind of growth that people want, the products that someone like Amazon sells, all that sort of stuff, so that we can all have the kind of products we want? But can we do it in such a way that we don't overconsume the Earth's natural resources? Now, the good news, and it genuinely is good news, is the answer is yes. It's quite a narrow path. It's not the path we're currently on. And so that when, I talk to my former colleagues at Amazon, or we think about that, we've got to say, how can we find a way where we deliver what people want, but we do it in a sustainable way? And actually, in some ways, all of that delivery stuff turns out in many ways to be much less harmful to the environment than people constantly getting in their own cars and driving to and fro shops and things like this. So you have to be really thoughtful about, is the way of doing it in such a way that it doesn't overconsume. So again, if you speak to Amazon specifically, Jeff and the team there launched the Climate Pledge, particularly to try and get companies to understand that they have a responsibility. Of course, they have to deliver. That's what companies do, the goods and the services we all want, but they've got to do it in the right way. And as I said, the good news is with your help and everybody's help, if we all get there, there is actually this path whereby we can still have all the products we want and still allow people to have a reasonable life, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't overconsume the Earth's natural resources. And that does mean a little bit of change from where we're going right now. And that's kind of what we do at the museum. We try and inspire people to care about the natural world and try and inspire them to sort of do the things that collectively are enough to sort of look after the planet.
Yeah, really interesting. Definitely learned some information there, and I hope that definitely answered the question. So I hope they kind of think we got a little bit more than even the question. So really enjoyable to hear about that and to be starting to think about kind of sustainability as well within kind of us getting everything you want, as we say, with this product. So really interesting. And I have a really great question next, but it might be a little bit of a short one. It's, what course would you advise to the students watching who might be interested in entering into kind of the museum technology world?
Brilliant question. Can I give you a very simple answer? Do what you love. I mean, there are so many routes in. We'll take people from any world. It matters less what you've done, that if you do something you really enjoy and you care passionately about, because if you do that, I promise you'll do better, you'll enjoy it more, and whoever looks at you as a potential employer in the future will just say, here's somebody who loves what they're doing, and those are the people we love to employ. So just follow whatever it is that most excites you.
I definitely love that. And we have time just for one more question before we kind of go to your kind of final thoughts. So the final question is, what do you think future museums might look like in, say, 100 years?
Oh, that is such a great question. And in a sense, you know, it's I mean, one of the things I learned in my time at Amazon is it's really hard to predict the future. It's just hard, and I could give you 100 examples of where we and everybody else have got it wrong. So I think, in a sense, as you do try and think about the future, the question I think I try and ask these days is what's not going to change. So in other words, what is still going to be true about a museum in 100 years? And if you think about our Natural History Museum here, we've been in this building for 130 years. Actually, our origins go back over 250 years. So we have to think in terms of those terms. And I'll tell you a few things that won't change. Museums will always be about the collection. That's ultimately what defines a collection. So I hope in 100 years' time, museums will have done 100 years more of collecting, will know a lot more. I can absolutely guarantee you that the role of museums will continue to be to use those collections to inspire people, inspire, in our case, a love of the natural world, an engagement, a curiosity about the world, a desire to more. And I think that role of museums as inspiring is so important. I can't see that really changing. I think what I can guarantee will change is museums, I'm sure, over the next 100 years, as this technology comes in, will be a lot more visible, a lot more transparent. If you like, I mean, we've just touched on it today, but so much of these collections is invisible. It's hidden behind locked doors, it's in hidden collection basements, it's in offsite storage, you know, people don't see it. I actually think in 100 years' time, all of that will hopefully have made visible using technology. And then off that technology, when somebody on this call or your successors in 50 years' time get really inspired by wanting to understand about the malaria beetles or whatever it is, they'll be able to go and visit that particular beetle. So I think, as I say, it's still going to be about collections, definitely about inspiring audiences, hopefully just, you know, much more visible to more people all around the world.
I'm now jealous of the future generations that will be around. So as we kind of come to close today, do you have any kind of final thoughts that you'd like to leave with our students?
Well, first of all, I would just say I'd like to say thank you. It's an enormous privilege to have the opportunity to participate in this program. And by the way, that's a thank you to Speakers for Schools. I think what the Speakers for Schools team does is amazing. And it's the first time I've done one of these virtually, but I've absolutely loved doing the physical visits out there and looking forward to getting back to those. Thank you to everybody who's dialed in and listened. And look, if any of this was of interest, I would just say two things to you. One is, I know a lot of you at that stage where you're thinking about choices and thinking about careers, and you have my deep sympathy because it's a more complicated world than the one I grew up in. But I think actually, if I have one thought, I'd just come to that point about follow your passion. You know, it's really hard to predict exactly what skills people are going to need. It's really hard to predict, you know, what we're going to go for. But I can guarantee you that when I look at all of the people who've gone on to have successful careers in whatever field, it tends to be the one who said, what is it that I just love doing? And let me just do that. You know, what is your favorite subject? Who's your favorite teacher? What is it that, you know, you do outside school that gets you excited? And hold hard to that, because that's one of those things that will stay with you. And whatever the skill sets and whatever the technologies and whatever the machines are of the future, if you're doing something you love, you're much more likely to do well and enjoy it at the same time.
Well, thank you for thanking us, but thank you so much for kind of giving your time, taking the time out of the day to come kind of talk to us. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure those watching have also learned a lot about machine learning and how technology will be used in museums now and in the future. It's been very, very insightful and really wonderful to listen to you talk. So thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Have a lovely day, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.